You know what? Let me start with a question that might sound simple, but I promise you it's not. What happens to a man's mind when you take away everything, and I mean everything, that civilization uses to keep people sane? No schedules, no neighbors, no laws except the ones nature writes in blood and bone, no human contact for months at a time, just you, the wilderness, and whatever's living inside your head. Most people would crack. Most people would go completely, utterly mad. But here's the thing that gets me about the early 1800s in America. There was this group of men who didn't just survive that kind of isolation. They thrived in it. They became legends because of it. And what they discovered about the human mind, well, it's something we're still trying to understand today. We're talking about the mountain men. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Mountain men? Aren't those just the guys with the big beards and the coonskin caps from the old movies? The ones who fought bears and talked to themselves? That's the Hollywood version. The real story is so much more fascinating, so much more complex, that it makes those old movies look like children's picture books. Picture this. It's 1803. Thomas Jefferson has just pulled off what might be the greatest real estate deal in human history, the Louisiana Purchase. With the stroke of a pen, America doubles in size. Doubles. We're talking about 828,000 square miles of nothing. Well, not nothing exactly. Mountains that scrape the sky. Rivers that run for thousands of miles without a single bridge. Forests so thick you can walk for weeks without seeing the sun. And somewhere out there, in all that vastness, there are animals whose fur is worth more than most people make in a year. But here's the catch, and there's always a catch. To get to those animals, to harvest that wealth, you have to survive in conditions that would kill most civilized men in a matter of days. Enter William Ashley. Now Ashley, he was a businessman, but he was also something of a revolutionary. In 1822, he placed an advertisement in a street Louis newspaper that would change American history. It read, "To enterprising young men, the subscriber wishes to engage 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1 to 3 years. Sounds innocent enough, right? But Ashley was proposing something that had never been tried before. Instead of sending out company men on company wages, he was creating independent contractors, entrepreneurs, men who would live or die by their own skills, their own decisions, their own psychological strength. Think about what that meant. These weren't soldiers with commanding officers. They weren't employees with supervisors. They were going to be completely, utterly alone with their own minds for months, sometimes years, at a time. The only backup they'd have would be whatever mental resilience they could forge in the wilderness. And here's where our story really begins, because the men who answered Ashley's call, they weren't your typical frontiersmen. They were something new, something that had never existed before in human history. Let me tell you about Hugh Glass. Hugh Glass was probably in his 40s when he signed up with Ashley, already old by frontier standards. He'd been a sailor, maybe a pirate, definitely a man who'd seen more of the world's ugliness than most. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared him for what happened in 1823. Glass was scouting ahead of his party near the Grand River when he stumbled into a grizzly bear with cubs. Now, we're not talking about some cartoon bear here. We're talking about 600 pounds of muscle, claws, and pure predatory instinct. The bear mauled Glass so badly that when his companions found him, they were certain he was going to die. His scalp was hanging loose. His back was laid open to the bone. He was unconscious and barely breathing. So his companions did what any reasonable men would do, and they took his weapons, his gear, and they left him to die. It was the practical thing to do, the smart thing to do. In the wilderness, sentiment gets everyone killed, but Glass didn't die. He regained consciousness alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, with wounds that would have killed most men outright. And here's where it gets incredible, where it shows you just what the human mind can accomplish when it has no choice but to adapt or perish. Glass began to crawl 200 miles through hostile territory with a broken leg, infected wounds, and no supplies except what he could scavenge. For 6 weeks, he crawled, walked, and dragged himself across a landscape that wanted him dead. But here's what I find most fascinating about Glass's ordeal. It wasn't just his body that survived. It was his mind. In his own words, he later said that during those weeks, he found a kind of clarity he'd never experienced before. The constant threat, the absolute necessity of making the right decision every single moment, had stripped away everything non-essential from his thinking. He wasn't Hugh Glass, the former sailor, anymore. He wasn't even Hugh Glass, the mountain man. He was pure survival instinct wrapped in human consciousness. And when he finally made it to Fort Kiowa, when he walked out of the wilderness, more dead than alive but undeniably alive, he'd proven something that no one had ever proven before, that the human mind, when pushed to its absolute limits, doesn't break, it transforms. Now, Glass's story became legend among the mountain men, but he wasn't unique. Not really, because around the same time, you had men like Jedediah Smith doing things that seemed equally impossible. Smith was different from Glass. Younger, more educated, deeply religious. He carried a Bible with him everywhere he went and held prayer, meetings in the wilderness. But don't mistake him for some naive Sunday school teacher. Smith was exploring territories that existed more as legend than reality. He was crossing deserts that Native American tribes considered cursed. He was finding paths through mountain ranges that seemed impassable. And here's what's remarkable. Smith discovered that successful wilderness navigation required more than just reading maps and following rivers. It required a kind of psychological navigation. You had to learn to read the landscape with your emotions, your intuition, your subconscious mind. A mountain peak wasn't just a geographic feature, it was a psychological landmark that could anchor your sanity during months of uncertainty. Smith learned this from Native American guides, particularly the Shoshone people who had been surviving in this landscape for thousands of years. They taught him that finding your way in the wilderness wasn't just about knowing where you were going. It was about knowing who you were in relationship to the land around you. But let me tell you about someone who really embodied this synthesis of cultures, Jim Beckwourth. Beckwourth was mixed race, part African American, part white, which meant he didn't quite fit into any of the neat categories that society preferred. But out in the wilderness, among the mountain men and the Native American tribes, those categories didn't matter. What mattered was your ability to survive, to contribute, to become part of something larger than yourself. Beckwourth spent years living with the Crow Nation, and here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because the Crow weren't just teaching mountain men how to track animals or find water. They were teaching them something much more sophisticated, how to maintain psychological balance in extreme isolation. The Crow had chiefs like Rotten Belly and Long Hair, who understood something that European culture had forgotten. They knew that mental health wasn't something you maintained by avoiding hardship. It was something you developed by learning to dance with hardship, to find harmony with natural cycles instead of fighting against them. They taught Beckwourth and other mountain men that reading weather patterns and animal behavior wasn't just a practical skill. It was a form of meditation. When you're tracking an elk through mountain terrain, you have to quiet your mind's chatter until you can hear what the forest is telling you, where the elk will go, when the weather will change, whether danger is approaching. This wasn't mysticism, although it might have seemed like it to outside observers. This was practical psychology. The Crow had developed mental techniques over generations that allowed them to process enormous amounts of environmental information at a subconscious level. And they were sharing these techniques with mountain men who were hungry to learn anything that would keep them alive. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because at the same time you had Shoshone guides who related to Sacagawea herself, who were teaching mountain men a different but equally sophisticated approach to wilderness psychology. The Shoshone understood that in vast landscapes where you might not see another human being for months, you needed psychological anchors. Distinctive rock formations, particular mountain peaks, specific river confluences, these weren't just navigation aids. They were spiritual centers that could ground your identity when everything else became uncertain. Think about what that means. These mountain men were learning to use landscape features as external memories, as psychological touchstones that could maintain their sense of self during extended periods of isolation. They were discovering that the wilderness wasn't just a place you survived in, it was a place that could actually strengthen your mind if you learned to relate to it properly. And this is where the mountain men began to develop something truly unique, a psychological toolkit that blended European determination, American independence, and Native American spiritual wisdom into something that had never existed before. But here's what I find most remarkable about this period. The men who were succeeding, as mountain men, weren't necessarily the toughest or the strongest. They were the ones who were most psychologically adaptable, the ones who could learn from Native American teachers without losing their own identity, the ones who could maintain hope and purpose during months of complete solitude. They were creating a new kind of mental resilience, forged in conditions so extreme that most people couldn't even imagine them, let alone survive them. And as word of their exploits began to filter back to civilization, NTII, stories of men who could navigate impossible terrain, survive grisly attacks, cross deadly deserts, something extraordinary began to happen. More men started heading west, drawn not just by the promise of wealth, but by the possibility of discovering what they were truly capable of when stripped of everything except their own psychological resources. The mountain man era was just beginning, and what these men were about to discover about the limits and possibilities of human mental resilience would echo through American culture for generations to come. But that's just the beginning of their story, because as these men pushed deeper into the wilderness, as they learned to thrive in isolation that would shatter most minds, they were about to face challenges that would test every psychological technique they'd learned. The wilderness was about to teach them that survival wasn't just about individual strength, it was about something much more complex, much more fascinating. It was about learning to forge mental toughness in conditions that would make a modern psychologist's textbook look like a children's story. And trust me, you're going to want to hear what happened next. Now, if you thought the early mountain men had it tough, wait until you hear what happened when winter hit the high country. Picture this, and I mean really, picture this. It's January 1828. You're camped somewhere in what will eventually become Montana, but right now it's just wilderness. The temperature has been sitting at 40 degrees below zero for 3 weeks straight. That's cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. Cold enough to snap trees like matchsticks. Cold enough to kill you in minutes if you make the wrong decision. And you're alone, completely, utterly alone, with whatever's happening inside your head. This is where the mountain men separated the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, because surviving a summer expedition into Indian Territory, that was just the entrance exam. Winter in the Rockies, TDA, that was the real test. Kit Carson figured this out early. Carson was still young during these years, maybe 20 years old, but he was already developing something that would make him legendary. And it wasn't just his tracking abilities, though those were supernatural enough to make other mountain men shake their heads in amazement. No, what Carson was developing was a form of psychological discipline that modern neuroscience is just beginning to understand. He called it reading sign, but it was really something much more sophisticated. It was learning to quiet his mind so completely that he could process enormous amounts of environmental information at a subconscious level. Here's how it worked. Carson would examine a disturbed pebble, a broken twig, a slight depression in the earth, and somehow, he could tell you not just what animal had passed there, but when whether it was healthy or injured, whether it was being hunted, and where it was likely to go next. Now, you might think this was just keen observation skills, but Carson himself described it differently. He said it was like learning to think with the landscape instead of thinking about the landscape. When he was tracking, his conscious mind would go almost silent, and some deeper part of his awareness would start processing patterns that his rational mind couldn't even see. This wasn't unique to Carson. Joe Walker was developing similar abilities for finding water in desert country. Walker could look at a landscape that appeared completely barren to everyone else, and somehow sense where underground springs might be located. Native American guides had taught him that finding water wasn't just about reading surface clues. It was about learning to feel the subtle energy patterns that water creates in a landscape. And here's the thing that gets me. These men weren't describing mystical experiences. They were describing practical survival skills that required rewiring their brains to process information in completely new ways. But let me tell you about an event that really shows you how these psychological techniques developed under pressure. November 1833. The Leonid meteor shower. Now, meteor showers happen all the time, but this one was different. This one was apocalyptic. For 3 consecutive nights, the entire sky filled with shooting stars. We're talking about thousands of meteors per hour, so many that people thought the world was ending. Native American tribes interpreted this as a message from the spirit world. Settlers in towns and cities panicked, convinced that Judgment Day had arrived. But the mountain men scattered across the wilderness had a different experience entirely. They were alone out there, remember. No newspapers to explain what was happening, no neighbors to share their fear with. Just them and the most spectacular celestial display in recorded history. And you know what happened? Instead of panicking, many of them reported a profound sense of connection. Not to God exactly, though some described it that way, but to something larger than themselves, to the universe itself. Hugh Glass was out there during the meteor shower, still recovering from his famous grisly encounter. He later said that watching those meteors streak across the sky while sitting alone by his campfire was one of the most peaceful moments of his life. Here was a man who had crawled 200 miles through hostile territory, and he found peace in what other people experienced as terror. This tells us something important about what was happening to the mountain men psychologically. They were learning to find meaning and even beauty in experiences that would overwhelm most people. They were developing what modern psychology might call anti-fragility, the ability to not just survive stress, but to become stronger because of it. But it wasn't just about individual psychological development. Because the mountain men weren't completely isolated, they had each other, even when they were hundreds of miles apart. And they had something that was creating bonds stronger than most family relationships. Shared trauma. John Colter's run from the Blackfoot Warriors in 1808 had become the stuff of legend by this time. But what made it legendary wasn't just the physical impossibility of what he'd accomplished. It was the psychological impossibility. Here's what happened. Colter was captured by Blackfoot warriors who decided to have some sport with him. They stripped him naked, gave him a head start, and told him to run. If he could outrun their best warriors, they'd let him live. If not, well, you can imagine. The distance Colter covered was about 6 miles across broken terrain, but he was running barefoot, naked, at altitude, with several Blackfoot warriors chasing him who knew the territory and were in peak physical condition. Colter not only outran them, he disappeared so completely that they couldn't find any trace of him. He hid underwater in a beaver pond, travelled at night, and made it to a trading post 11 days. Later, having covered over 200 miles without clothes, weapons, or supplies. Now, stories like this might sound exaggerated, but here's what's important. Other mountain men believed them, and believing them changed how they thought about their own psychological limits. If Colter could do the impossible when his life depended on it, What could they do? What was actually possible when you stripped away all the mental limitations that civilized life had taught you to accept? This is where the mountain men began developing what I can only describe as a shared psychological culture. They weren't just individual survivors anymore. They were part of a brotherhood that was collectively pushing the boundaries of human mental endurance. And this brotherhood had rituals, informal ones, but rituals nonetheless. When mountain men encountered each other in the wilderness, which didn't happen often, but it happened, there were certain things they always did. They shared information about weather patterns, about Indian movements, about the locations of game animals, but more importantly, they shared stories. These weren't just entertainment. These stories served a crucial psychological function. They were processing trauma, sharing survival techniques, and reinforcing the mental frameworks that kept them alive. Tom Fitzpatrick understood this better than most. Fitzpatrick was what they called a brigade leader, one of the few mountain men who regularly led groups of other trappers. And he discovered something important about group psychology in extreme environments. Individual mountain men could survive almost anything, but groups of mountain men could accomplish things that seemed literally impossible. Fitzpatrick led expeditions that crossed territories no white man had ever seen. They navigated mountain passes that existed more as legend than reality. They survived winter storms that should have killed them all. And they did it by developing a kind of collective, psychological resilience that was greater than the sum of its parts. Here's how it worked. When one man's morale started to crack, and it always did, eventually, the others would shore him up with stories, with shared tasks, with the simple knowledge that he wasn't facing the wilderness alone. When someone made a mistake that could have gotten everyone killed, the group would process it collectively, learning from it without destroying the individual's confidence. They were creating, without realizing it, one of the most sophisticated peer support networks in human history. But the real test of this psychological development came during the conflicts with Native American tribes. And I want to be very clear about something here. These conflicts were complex, with valid grievances and legitimate fears on all sides. The mountain men were trespassing on tribal hunting grounds. The tribes were defending territory that had been theirs for generations. But what interests me from a psychological standpoint is how the mountain men adapted to warfare that was completely different from anything European or American military training had prepared them for. Blackfoot raids, for instance, weren't like European battles with clear front lines and defined objectives. They were psychological warfare as much as physical combat. A Blackfoot war party might shadow a group of mountain men for weeks, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, creating constant tension without ever engaging in direct combat. This required mountain men to develop new forms of mental toughness. They had to learn to function effectively while living in a state of perpetual alertness. They had to make life or death decisions based on incomplete information. They had to maintain group cohesion while never knowing when they might be attacked. And here's what's remarkable. They got good at it. Really good at it. Mountain men developed threat assessment abilities that seem almost supernatural by modern standards. They could sense danger from subtle changes in bird behavior, from barely perceptible shifts in the wind, from intuitive feelings that something wasn't right. Jim Bridger became legendary for this. Bridger could tell you whether Indian sign was 2 hours old or 2 days old by examining tracks that other experienced frontiersmen couldn't even see. He could predict weather changes days in advance by reading cloud formations and wind patterns. He could navigate through unmapped territory by dead reckoning so accurate that modern GPS systems would be impressed. But here's what I find most fascinating about Bridger. He didn't describe these abilities as special talents. He described them as things any mountain man could learn if he was willing to pay attention to what the wilderness was teaching him. The wilderness was a harsh teacher, but it was a thorough one, and the mountain men who survived long enough were graduating with psychological skills that gave them almost superhuman capabilities. They were learning to read micro-expressions on Native American faces that could mean the difference between successful negotiation and violent conflict. They were developing spatial memory so precise they could navigate back to a specific tree in thousands of square miles of identical-looking forest. They were training their subconscious minds to wake them at the exact moment when something in their environment changed. These weren't mystical abilities. They were the result of intensive psychological conditioning under life-or-death pressure. And as the 1830s progressed, as more men survived their first winters and their first Indian encounters, word began to filter back to civilization about what was possible out there in the wilderness. The mountain men weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. They were becoming something new, something that had never existed before in human history. Eyeful men, whose psychological development had been forged in Setri. Conditions so extreme that they bordered on the superhuman, but they were about to face their greatest test yet, because as their individual skills reached almost impossible levels, they were about to discover something even more remarkable. They were about to learn that the real power of the wilderness wasn't in creating individual psychological warriors. It was in creating a community of minds so synchronized, so mutually supportive, that they could accomplish things that would make their individual achievements look small by comparison. The golden age of the mountain men was about to begin, and what they would accomplish during that period would redefine what people thought was possible for human psychological development. Trust me, what's coming next will change how you think about the limits of human potential. By the 1830s, something extraordinary was happening in the American wilderness. The mountain men weren't just surviving anymore. They were mastering psychological territories that most people didn't even know existed. And nowhere was this more evident than at the annual rendezvous. Now, when I say rendezvous, you might picture some casual gathering of rough men trading furs and telling tall tales. But what actually happened at these gatherings was something much more sophisticated, much more psychologically complex than anyone realized at the time. Picture this. You're a mountain man who's been alone in the wilderness for 8 months. 8 months without seeing another human face, without hearing another human voice except your own. You've survived blizzards that would have killed lesser men. You've outmaneuvered war parties, found water in impossible places, and made decisions that meant the difference between life and death dozens of times. And then, suddenly, you arrive at rendezvous, and there are hundreds of other men who've done exactly the same thing. The psychological impact was profound. These gatherings weren't just trading posts. They were therapeutic communities where men who'd pushed human mental endurance to its limits could recalibrate their relationship with humanity itself. Jim Bridger understood this better than most. By the 1830s, Bridger had become something of a legend among the mountain men, and not just for his tracking abilities. Bridger had developed psychological techniques that seemed to border on the supernatural. He could navigate through unmapped territory using what he called mountain sense, a form of intuitive awareness that allowed him to predict weather patterns days in advance, locate game animals across vast distances, and find routes through seemingly impassable terrain. But here's what's remarkable about Bridger. He didn't keep these techniques to himself. At rendezvous gatherings, he would spend hours teaching younger mountain men how to develop similar abilities. And what he was teaching them wasn't just wilderness skills. It was a complete system of psychological development. Bridger had learned from Shoshone medicine men how to enter what modern psychology might call altered states of consciousness. But he didn't experience them as altered states. He experienced them as natural extensions of human awareness that became accessible when you removed all the mental clutter that civilization had trained you to carry around. Here's how it worked. When Bridger was navigating through unknown territory, he would quiet his conscious mind until he could feel the subtle patterns that connected landscape features. A distant mountain peak wasn't just a geographic landmark. It was part of a larger system of relationships that included weather patterns, animal migration routes, and water sources. Learning to read these relationships required developing what the Shoshone called mountain thinking, a a form of awareness that processed enormous amounts of environmental information at an intuitive level. And Bridger wasn't the only one developing these abilities. Tom Fitzpatrick had become legendary for his ability to read human psychology as accurately as other men read animal tracks. Fitzpatrick could walk into a Native American village and somehow sense whether the mood was friendly, neutral, or hostile before anyone said a word. This wasn't guesswork. Fitzpatrick had learned to read micro-expressions, body language, and even subtle changes in vocal tone that revealed emotional states more accurately than conscious communication. He could predict whether negotiations would be successful or whether violence was likely before most people even realized there was tension in the air. But what I find most fascinating about this period is how these individual psychological developments began to create collective capabilities that were greater than the sum of their parts. The rendezvous culture had developed elaborate codes of honor that served as psychological safety nets during the dangerous months of isolation. When Tom Fitzpatrick gave his word, it meant something not just to him personally but to the entire Mountain Man community. His reputation for reliability became part of a trust network that allowed independent operators to function across vast territories without any legal enforcement. Think about what that means. These men were creating informal institutions based purely on psychological principles. Yes, nine. Mutual respect, proven reliability, and shared understanding of what it took to survive in extreme conditions. And these institutions were remarkably sophisticated. The rendezvous gatherings included ritualized competitions that weren't just entertainment. They were ways of processing trauma, maintaining physical skills, and reinforcing the psychological frameworks that kept everyone alive. Shooting competitions, wrestling matches, storytelling contests, nori-telling. These activities served crucial mental health functions. They allowed mountain men to demonstrate their capabilities in safe environments, to process dangerous experiences through narrative, and to maintain connections with human community that would sustain them through the next period of isolation. But perhaps most importantly, the rendezvous culture incorporated healing practices borrowed from plains tribes that helped mountain men process the psychological impact of extreme experiences. Sweat lodge ceremonies adapted for European minds provided structured ways to release emotional tension. Vision quest practices allowed mountain men to integrate traumatic experiences into larger frameworks of meaning. Plant medicine traditions, redusnor, carefully supervised and culturally appropriate, helped process trauma and maintain psychological balance. These weren't exotic rituals to the mountain men. They were practical mental health tools that had been tested over generations by cultures that understood how to maintain psychological stability in challenging environments. And the results were remarkable. Mountain men who participated regularly in rendezvous gatherings showed psychological resilience that seemed almost impossible by civilized standards. They could process traumatic experiences without developing what we might now recognize as PTSD. They could maintain hope and purpose during extended periods of uncertainty. They could make clear-headed decisions under life-threatening pressure. But let me tell you about someone who really embodied this psychological mastery: Pierre Chouteau Jr. Chouteau was different from most mountain men because he operated on multiple levels simultaneously. He was successful in the wilderness, but he also understood the economic and political forces that were shaping the fur trade. And what he discovered was that psychological skills developed in extreme wilderness conditions provided enormous advantages in civilized contexts as well. Chouteau could read the intentions of Native American chiefs, government officials, and business competitors with equal accuracy. He could predict market trends by understanding how environmental factors would affect fur production. He could negotiate complex agreements because he understood the psychological motivations of everyone involved. In other words, Chouteau demonstrated that the psychological techniques mountain men developed in the wilderness weren't just survival skills. They were advanced forms of human development that enhanced every aspect of cognitive function. And this is where the mountain men began to achieve something truly extraordinary. They weren't just individual psychological warriors anymore. They were part of a collective intelligence network that could process information and make decisions at a level that seemed almost superhuman. When experienced mountain men encountered each other in the wilderness, they could communicate enormous amounts of information through subtle signals that outside observers wouldn't even notice. A slight change in posture could indicate the presence of hostile Indians. A particular way of arranging equipment could signal weather patterns. A specific campfire configuration could communicate whether the area was safe or dangerous. This wasn't a formal code system. It was an intuitive communication network that had developed naturally among men, whose survival depended on processing and sharing accurate information quickly and efficiently. Joe Meek understood this network better than most. Meek had spent years living with various Native American tribes, and he'd learned something important about collective psychology. Individual intelligence, no matter how highly developed, had limits. But collective intelligence, EZ, when properly organized, could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Meek could walk into a rendezvous gathering and somehow sense the overall mood, the flow of information, and the undercurrents of tension or cooperation that would shape events over the following weeks. He could predict which expeditions would be successful and which would end in disaster based on subtle psychological factors that most people couldn't even see. And here's what's remarkable. Meek's predictions were usually accurate, not because he was psychic, but because he'd learned to read the collective psychological state of the mountain man community with the same accuracy that other men read weather patterns. This is where the mountain men achieved their psychological peak. They weren't just surviving in extreme conditions anymore. They were thriving in ways that demonstrated new possibilities for human mental development. They could navigate through territories that existed more as psychological landscape than physical geography. They could predict events based on subtle pattern recognition that processed information faster than conscious thought. They could maintain psychological stability in conditions that would break most modern minds. But most importantly, they had learned to function as a collective intelligence that was greater than any individual contribution. The mountain man community had become something new in human history, a network of highly developed minds that could accomplish things that seemed literally impossible. And they were about to prove it in ways that would become legendary, because as the 1830s progressed, the mountain men were facing challenges that would test every psychological technique they'd developed. The beaver were becoming harder to find. Competition from other trappers was intensifying. Relations with Native American tribes were becoming more complex and dangerous. But the mountain men had something that no previous generation of humans had ever possessed. Psychological tools, forged in the crucible of extreme wilderness experience, refined through years of collective learning, and tested under conditions that pushed human mental capability to its absolute limits. What they were about to accomplish during their peak years would redefine what people thought was possible for human psychological development. And the techniques they developed would influence American culture for generations to come. The real test was just beginning, and trust me, what happens next will show you capabilities of the human mind that most people never even imagined were possible. Now, here's where the mountain man story takes a turn that might surprise you, because by the late 1830s, these men weren't just psychological warriors anymore. They were becoming something that modern science doesn't have a good name for. Spiritual scientists, maybe, or mystical pragmatists. And the man who embodied this transformation more than anyone else was Jedediah Smith. Smith was unlike any other mountain man of his era. He was deeply religious, educated, and he carried his Bible through every expedition into unmapped wilderness. But here's what makes Smith's story so fascinating. Instead of his Christianity conflicting with wilderness spirituality, it somehow enhanced it. Smith had learned vision quest techniques from Ute medicine men during his early expeditions. These weren't casual exchanges of information. The Ute had recognized something in Smith, a spiritual hunger that matched their own understanding of how the natural world could teach human consciousness. And Smith discovered something remarkable. The psychological techniques he'd learned for wilderness survival, the deep observation, the intuitive awareness, the ability to quiet his conscious mind, were almost identical to the contemplative practices described in Christian mystical traditions. When Smith was navigating through unknown territory, he would enter what he described as a state of divine guidance. But this wasn't passive prayer. It was an active form of spiritual consciousness that integrated intensive observation of natural phenomena with intuitive decision-making that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. Smith could predict weather patterns days in advance by reading cloud formations and wind currents with almost supernatural accuracy. He could locate water sources in desert country that appeared completely barren to other experienced frontiersmen. He could find routes through mountain passes that seemed impassable. But Smith didn't attribute these abilities to special talent. He attributed them to learning how to listen to what he called the voice of God speaking through the landscape. Now, you might dismiss this as religious superstition, but here's what's remarkable. Smith's navigation was measurably more accurate than other mountain men using conventional techniques. His weather predictions were consistently reliable. His route-finding abilities were so extraordinary that other mountain men would change their plans based on Smith's recommendations. In other words, whatever Smith was doing, it worked, and it worked better than purely rational approaches to wilderness navigation. Joe Meek had a different but equally remarkable spiritual development. Meek had spent years living with various Native American tribes, and he'd absorbed something profound about how indigenous cultures understood the relationship between human consciousness and natural environments. Meek learned to treat prominent landscape features, distinctive peaks, river confluences, unusual rock formations, as what he called thinking places. These weren't just navigation landmarks. They were locations where the boundary between individual consciousness and larger natural patterns became permeable. When Meek was facing a difficult decision or trying to solve a complex problem, he would spend time at one of these thinking places, allowing his mind to become still until solutions would emerge that his rational thinking couldn't have produced. This wasn't wishful thinking or romantic nature worship. Meek's decision-making during this period was remarkably sound. He avoided conflicts that destroyed other mountain men. He found profitable trapping territories that others missed. He maintained good relationships with Native American tribes through periods when other traders were being killed or driven out. Meek had learned something that modern cognitive science is just beginning to understand. Of complex problem-solving often requires integrating conscious analysis with subconscious pattern recognition that operates below the mold, threshold of rational thought. But perhaps the most remarkable spiritual development among the mountain men was their response to the 1837 smallpox epidemic. This epidemic was devastating beyond anything most people can imagine. Entire Native American villages were wiped out. Tribes that had existed for centuries simply disappeared. The psychological impact on mountain men who had formed deep friendships with tribal communities was profound. Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger were among the survivors who witnessed this catastrophe firsthand. They watched friends die horrible deaths. They saw cultures that had taught them crucial survival skills simply cease to exist. Most people would have been psychologically shattered by experiences like this. But Glass and Bridger developed spiritual frameworks that allowed them to integrate even these traumatic experiences into larger patterns of meaning. Glass began to describe the wilderness as a kind of living entity that included both creation and destruction as necessary aspects of natural cycles. Individual tragedies, no matter how heartbreaking, were part of larger patterns that human consciousness could learn to accept without being destroyed by them. Bridger developed what he called mountain philosophy, a way of understanding human existence that found meaning in the struggle itself rather than in achieving particular outcomes. According to Bridger's philosophy, The wilderness taught consciousness how to remain stable and purposeful, even when external circumstances were completely unpredictable. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were practical mental frameworks that allowed mountain men to function effectively in conditions that would break most people psychologically. And during this peak period, mountain men developed mental health practices that seem remarkably sophisticated by modern standards. They practiced systematic dream interpretation, using nighttime consciousness to process complex environmental information that their waking minds couldn't organize effectively. Many mountain men reported that solutions to navigation problems or predictions about weather would come to them in dreams with remarkable accuracy. They developed personal relationships with what they called animal spirits, not supernatural entities but psychological techniques that used animal behavior patterns as models for human decision-making. A mountain man might develop a bear spirit that taught him about preparing for winter, or a wolf spirit that guided his understanding of pack dynamics and territorial behavior. They created sacred objects, often simple items like distinctive stones or carved pieces of wood, that served as psychological anchors during extended periods of isolation. These objects weren't magical talismans. They were memory devices that helped maintain psychological continuity when everything else in their environment was constantly changing. And perhaps most importantly, they learned to use solitude itself as a spiritual practice. Most people fear isolation because it forces them to confront aspects of their own consciousness that social interaction normally keeps hidden. But mountain men discovered that extended solitude, when approached with appropriate mental discipline, could become a form of spiritual development that enhanced every aspect of psychological function. Mountain men who had mastered solitude reported experiences that sound almost mystical, a sense of connection to natural patterns that transcended individual identity, enhanced intuitive awareness that seemed to border on telepathy, and a deep sense of peace that remained stable even during life-threatening situations. But these weren't escape fantasies or romantic delusions. Mountain men who achieved these states of consciousness were measurably more effective at wilderness survival. They made better decisions under pressure. They maintained hope and purpose during impossible hardships. They developed leadership abilities that inspired confidence in other experienced frontiersmen. The spiritual peak of the mountain man era represented something unique in human history. A large group of individuals who had discovered how to use extreme environmental conditions as catalysts for advanced psychological and spiritual development. And the techniques they developed weren't limited to wilderness applications. Mountain men who returned to civilized environments often demonstrated enhanced capabilities in business, politics, and social leadership that reflected the consciousness development they'd achieved in the mountains. Kit Carson's later career as a military scout and Indian agent, Tom Fitzpatrick's success as a diplomat and treaty negotiator, Jim Bridger's reputation as the most reliable guide in the American West, Rio. These achievements reflected psychological capabilities that had been forged through spiritual practices disguised as wilderness survival techniques. The mountain men had proved something remarkable about human potential. They had demonstrated that consciousness itself could be developed through intensive practice under challenging conditions, and that this development could produce capabilities that seemed almost superhuman by ordinary standards. But they were about to face their greatest test, because the very success of their spiritual and psychological development was about to attract forces that would threaten to destroy everything they had built. The outside world was beginning to notice what was happening in the wilderness, and what was coming next would test whether their spiritual achievements could survive contact with the very civilization they had left behind. And then, everything changed. It started innocently enough, a few wagon trains heading west, some railroad surveys that didn't seem immediately threatening, rumors of gold discoveries that most mountain men dismissed as wildly exaggerated. But by the 1850s, those innocuous changes had become an avalanche that would bury the mountain man era forever. The California Gold Rush of 1849 wasn't just an economic event, it was a psychological catastrophe for the mountain men. In the space of a single year, their private wilderness sanctuary became a highway for thousands of gold-hungry settlers who had no understanding of and no respect for the delicate relationships that mountain men had spent decades developing with the land and its original inhabitants. Kit Carson saw it coming before most. Carson had achieved legendary status among the mountain men for his tracking abilities and his diplomatic skills with Native American tribes. But as the 1850s progressed, Carson found himself caught between two worlds that were becoming increasingly incompatible. The United States government wanted to use Carson's wilderness expertise for military purposes, scouting for army expeditions, negotiating with hostile tribes, opening routes for wagon trains and railroads. The work was steady, the pay was reliable, and Carson's family needed the security. But accepting government employment meant abandoning the very wilderness relationships that had made Carson legendary in the first place. Think about the psychological tension here. Carson had spent decades developing mental frameworks that were based on respect for Native American cultures, harmony with natural cycles, and independence from civilized institutions. Now he was being asked to use those same skills to help destroy the cultures that had taught him, to facilitate the transformation of wilderness into farmland, and to subordinate his hard-won independence to military hierarchy. Carson tried to bridge both worlds, but the psychological costs were enormous. His later writings reveal a man who was increasingly torn between loyalty to his adopted country and grief for the wilderness culture that had shaped his identity. And Carson wasn't alone. Mountain men across the West were facing similar dilemmas as the economic foundations of their lifestyle disappeared beneath them. The beaver trade, which had provided the economic justification for their wilderness expeditions, was collapsing due to changes in fashion and the development of alternative materials. Silk hats had replaced beaver felt as the preferred style for gentlemen. The demand for beaver pelts, which had driven the entire mountain man economy, simply evaporated. But the economic disruption was just the surface of a much deeper psychological crisis. Mountain men had developed highly specialized mental frameworks that were perfectly adapted to wilderness conditions, but almost useless in the rapidly changing social and economic environment of mid-19th century America. Their enhanced spatial memory, which could navigate thousands of square miles of unmarked territory, had limited value in towns with street signs and numbered addresses. Their supernatural weather prediction abilities were irrelevant in communities with telegraph communication and printed weather reports. Their stress management techniques, which had sustained them through months of life-threatening isolation, seemed excessive and even antisocial in civilized environments where people expected predictable social interaction. Jim Beckwourth tried harder than most to adapt to changing conditions. Beckwourth had always been something of an entrepreneur, and he attempted to monetize his wilderness skills by establishing trading posts and serving as a guide for wagon trains. But Beckwourth discovered something that would become a common pattern among former mountain men. The very psychological specialization that had made them legendary in the wilderness made them misfits in civilized society. Beckwourth's autobiography, published in his later years, reveals a man struggling to maintain his sense of identity and purpose in a world that no longer valued the capabilities he had spent decades developing. His stories of wilderness adventures become increasingly elaborate and possibly exaggerated, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his readers that his experiences had been meaningful. The Mormon migration and the Oregon Trail brought changes that went beyond individual adaptation challenges. These movements represented systematic colonization of territories that mountain men had considered their psychological home. The very landscapes that had served as spiritual anchors during their wilderness development were being transformed into farmland, towns, and transportation corridors. The thinking places that had provided psychological grounding were being claimed by settlers who saw them only as potential building sites or agricultural land. Joe Meek experienced this transformation more personally than most. Meek had spent years developing intimate relationships with specific landscape features in what is now Oregon. He knew individual trees, rock formations, and river bends that had served as psychological landmarks during his wilderness years. But as Oregon territory became increasingly settled, Meek watched his personal geography disappear under roads, fences, and buildings. The places that had anchored his identity and provided spiritual sustenance were being systematically erased by agricultural development. Meek's response was typical of many mountain men during this period. He retreated deeper into increasingly remote wilderness areas, essentially choosing psychological consistency over economic adaptation. But retreat wasn't a sustainable strategy, because the pace of Western expansion was accelerating beyond anything anyone had anticipated. The discovery of gold in California had triggered a migration that brought more people west in 5 years than had moved there in the previous 50. The Compromise of 1850 had organized Western territories under federal jurisdiction, bringing law enforcement and governmental administration to regions that had previously been governed only by informal agreements among mountain men and Native American tribes. Most devastating of all, the Transcontinental Railroad was becoming a reality. Survey crews were already marking routes through mountain passes that mountain men had discovered and considered their private pathways to wilderness solitude. Tom Fitzpatrick understood the implications better than most. Fitzpatrick had become one of the most successful mountain men through his ability to read political and economic trends as accurately as he read weather patterns. And what Fitzpatrick saw coming was the complete destruction of the economic, social, and environmental conditions that had made mountain man culture possible. The railroad would make wilderness travel routine rather than heroic. Telegraph communication would eliminate the isolation that had forced mountain men to develop their remarkable psychological capabilities. Federal law enforcement would replace the informal codes of honor that had governed mountain man society. Fitzpatrick tried to use his diplomatic skills to negotiate a middle ground, serving as an Indian agent, helping to establish treaties that might preserve some wilderness areas while accommodating westward expansion. But Fitzpatrick discovered that the forces driving Western expansion weren't interested in compromise. They wanted complete transformation of the Western landscape from wilderness to civilization, and they had the political and economic power to achieve it. The psychological impact on surviving mountain men was devastating. They found themselves strangers in their own country, possessed of skills that no longer provided competitive advantages and mental frameworks that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the modern world. Some tried to adapt by becoming entertainers, telling wilderness stories to audiences who experienced them as exotic adventures rather than authentic experiences. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows would later represent the ultimate commercialization of mountain man culture, turning genuine spiritual and psychological development into theatrical spectacle. Others retreated into alcoholism, unable to find meaning or purpose in a world that had moved beyond their understanding. The mountain men's legendary psychological resilience, which had sustained them through impossible wilderness challenges, proved inadequate for coping with the existential crisis of cultural obsolescence. But perhaps most tragically, many mountain men lost the spiritual connections to landscape and natural cycles that had provided the foundation for their psychological development. Living in towns with regular schedules and social expectations, they were cut off from the wilderness relationships that had sustained their mental health for decades. The mountain man era was ending not with dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but with the quiet psychological surrender of men who could no longer find places where their hard-won wisdom was valued or even understood. And yet, even as their culture was dying, the mountain men were creating a legacy that would influence American consciousness for generations to come. The question was whether anyone would recognize that legacy before it disappeared entirely. By the 1860s, you could count the true mountain men on your fingers. Most had died, disappeared into remote wilderness areas, or tried to adapt to civilized life with varying degrees of success. But a few had become something unexpected. Living libraries of wilderness psychology, who understood that they were carrying knowledge that would soon be lost forever. Hugh Glass was one of these final guardians. Glass was in his 70s by this time, ancient by frontier standards, but his mind remained sharp and his memory was encyclopedic. More importantly, Glass had developed something that younger mountain men lacked: historical perspective about what they had accomplished and what was being lost. Glass spent his final years in trading posts and frontier settlements, not because he preferred civilization, but because he had become a deliberate curator of mountain man wisdom. He would sit with anyone willing to listen and provide detailed accounts not just of wilderness adventures, but of the psychological techniques that had allowed ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. Glass's descriptions of survival methods were remarkably sophisticated. He could explain how to maintain hope during impossible situations by breaking overwhelming challenges into manageable mental tasks. He understood how physical hardship could be used as mental training, building psychological resilience through controlled exposure to stress. Most importantly, Glass had developed a systematic understanding of how to find meaning in landscapes that appeared hostile and barren to untrained eyes. He could teach someone how to read the subtle communications that natural environments provided to those who knew how to listen. But Glass was fighting a losing battle against time and cultural change. The young men who sought him out were usually looking for dramatic adventure stories, not sophisticated instruction in wilderness psychology. They wanted to hear about grisly attacks and Indian raids, not careful analysis of meditation techniques and stress management protocols. The Civil War provided a brief reprieve for some mountain men by creating demand for their specialized skills in military contexts. Kit Carson's service as a scout and his controversial role in the Navajo campaigns demonstrated how wilderness mental toughness could adapt to conventional warfare. But Carson's military service also revealed the psychological costs of using frontier skills for government policies that destroyed the very Native American cultures that had taught mountain men their spiritual practices. Carson's later writings reveal a man increasingly troubled by the contradictions of his position. He had learned psychological resilience and spiritual wisdom from Native American teachers, but he was now using those same skills to implement policies that displaced and destroyed tribal communities. This wasn't just a political contradiction. It was a spiritual crisis that challenged the very foundations of Carson's identity and worldview. Jim Bridger represented a different approach to the end of the mountain man era. Bridger had always been more of a practical businessman than a romantic adventurer, and he adapted to changing conditions by becoming what might have been the first wilderness guide in American history. Bridger established Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming, which became a crucial supply point for wagon trains heading to California and Oregon. But more importantly, Bridger used his position to preserve and transmit mountain man knowledge to the next generation of Western travelers. Bridger's guiding services weren't just about showing people safe routes through dangerous territory. They were informal schools in wilderness psychology that taught travelers how to read weather patterns, assess threat levels, and maintain psychological stability during extended periods of uncertainty and hardship. Bridger understood something that few people recognized at the time. The psychological techniques mountain men had developed weren't just survival skills for extreme wilderness conditions. They were advanced forms of human development that could enhance effectiveness in any challenging environment. Bridger's clients included military, officers, territorial governors, business leaders, and scientists who were exploring Western territories. Many of them reported that their time with Bridger had changed not just their understanding of wilderness travel, but their approach to leadership, decision-making, and stress management in their professional lives. But perhaps the most remarkable preservation effort came from Joe Meek, who had become something of a political figure in Oregon Territory. Meek used his position to establish informal networks of former mountain men who were committed to preserving wilderness wisdom for future generations. These weren't formal organizations with written documents and official meetings. They were personal relationships based on shared understanding of what was being lost and why it mattered. Meek and his associates would seek out young men who showed aptitude for wilderness skills and provide them with intensive training that went far beyond conventional outdoor education. They taught advanced observation techniques, stress inoculation methods, and spiritual practices that integrated Christian faith with Native American wisdom. Most importantly, they transmitted the understanding that wilderness experience could be a form of spiritual development that enhanced every aspect of human consciousness. But these preservation efforts were fighting against forces much larger than individual initiative could overcome. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 delivered the final blow to mountain man culture by making wilderness travel routine rather than heroic. What had previously required months of dangerous expedition could now be accomplished in days of comfortable train travel. The railroad didn't just change transportation, it changed the entire relationship between human consciousness and Western landscapes. Passengers could cross the continental divide while reading newspapers and eating meals prepared in distant cities. The immediate connection with natural environments that had forced mountain men to develop their psychological capabilities was replaced by the passive observation of scenic views through train windows. The last true mountain men understood what this meant. They were watching the death not just of their lifestyle, but of an entire approach to human development that had produced capabilities unique in human history. Some of them retreated deeper into increasingly remote wilderness areas, essentially choosing to die with their culture rather than adapt to a world that no longer valued their wisdom. But others made a different choice. They became deliberate preservationists, documenting their knowledge and seeking opportunities to pass it on to anyone willing to learn. These final mountain men understood that they had been part of something historically significant, a unique experiment in human psychological development that had proved things about mental resilience, spiritual growth, and consciousness evolution that mainstream culture was nowhere near ready to understand. Their task was to preserve that knowledge in forms that might survive until future generations were ready to appreciate its value. And in some ways, they succeeded. The mountain men's understanding of how extreme environments could forge extraordinary psychological strength would eventually influence military training, outdoor education, and therapeutic approaches that are still developing today. But in other ways, their preservation efforts were incomplete. The spiritual synthesis they had achieved, the integration of European determination, American independence, and Native American wisdom into advanced forms of consciousness development, was too complex and too culturally specific to be easily transmitted to future generations. The mountain men had achieved something remarkable, but they had achieved it under conditions that could never be exactly replicated. They had been the right people in the right place at the right time to discover capabilities of human consciousness that most people never even suspected existed. And now that moment was ending. The wilderness that had served as their laboratory was being transformed into farmland and towns. The Native American cultures that had taught them essential spiritual practices were being destroyed or displaced. The economic conditions that had provided justification for their lifestyle had disappeared. The mountain men were becoming living relics of an era that was already slipping into legend rather than history, but their legacy was more durable than they realized. They had planted seeds that would germinate in unexpected places and unexpected times, influencing American culture in ways that wouldn't become apparent for generations. The question was whether future Americans would recognize those seeds for what they were, the fragments of hard-won wisdom about human potential that had been discovered under conditions of extreme challenge and preserved through factive mold, the dedication of men who understood that they were carrying something precious that the world was not yet ready to value. So what happened to all that hard-won wisdom when the last mountain man died? Did it just disappear into the mists of history like so many other forgotten skills and forgotten ways of life? Here's the remarkable thing. It didn't disappear. It went underground, transformed itself, and re-emerged in places and ways that even the mountain men themselves could never have anticipated. The first place you can see this legacy is in the American military, particularly in what would eventually become Special Operations Forces. When the United States entered World War I, military leaders discovered that conventional European tactics were inadequate for the new realities of modern warfare. They needed soldiers who could operate independently behind enemy lines, who could navigate by dead reckoning through unmapped territory, who could make life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. In other words, they needed soldiers with psychological capabilities remarkably similar to those the mountain men had developed in the wilderness. Military psychologists began studying the few surviving accounts of mountain man training methods and developing systematic approaches to building similar capabilities in modern soldiers. The stress inoculation techniques, the enhanced observation skills, the ability to maintain psychological stability during extended periods of uncertainty, these became foundational elements of Special Forces training. But the influence went deeper than just military applications. Theodore Roosevelt had spent time in his youth with some of the last mountain men, and their influence on his thinking was profound. Roosevelt's conservation philosophy, his approach to political leadership, and his understanding of how challenging experiences could build character, all reflected psychological insights he had learned from wilderness veterans. When Roosevelt established the National Park Service, he wasn't just preserving scenic landscapes. He was attempting to preserve opportunities for the kind of consciousness development that the mountain men had achieved through wilderness experience. Roosevelt understood something that most politicians of his era didn't, that American democracy needed citizens who had developed the psychological capabilities that extreme challenges could forge. Independence of mind, resilience under pressure, the ability to make sound decisions based on careful observation rather than popular opinion. John Muir took this preservation effort in a different direction. Muir's wilderness philosophy and his founding of the Sierra Club represented an attempt to make mountain man consciousness development accessible to ordinary citizens through what he called wilderness pilgrimage. Muir had studied the accounts of mountain men like Jedediah Smith and Joe Meek, and he understood that their spiritual development hadn't been accidental. It had been the result of specific practices that could be adapted for people who weren't planning to spend decades alone in unmapped territory. Muir's guided expeditions into the Sierra Nevada were essentially wilderness therapy programs designed to provide urban Americans with controlled exposure to the psychological challenges that had forged mountain man consciousness. Participants in Muir's expeditions regularly reported experiences that echoed mountain man accounts, enhanced awareness of natural patterns, spiritual insights that emerged during periods of solitude, and lasting changes in their approach to decision-making and stress management. But perhaps the most significant preservation of mountain man wisdom came through an unexpected source, the development of modern psychology itself. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, never met a mountain man directly, but Jung had studied Native American spiritual practices extensively, and he recognized that the psychological techniques mountain men had learned from tribal teachers represented sophisticated approaches to consciousness development that academic psychology was just beginning to understand. Jung's concepts of individuation, shadow work, and the integration of conscious and unconscious mental processes were remarkably similar to the spiritual practices that mountain men had developed through their synthesis of European, American, and Native American traditions. When Jung wrote about the need to integrate civilized consciousness with primitive wisdom, when he described vision quests and wilderness solitude as essential elements of psychological development, he was essentially providing academic validation for insights that mountain men had discovered through necessity. and Jung's influence on 20th century psychology was enormous. The entire field of wilderness therapy, adventure-based counseling, and outdoor education can trace its theoretical foundations to Jungian concepts that were themselves derived from the same sources that had influenced mountain man consciousness development. But the mountain men's legacy extends beyond psychology and conservation into the very heart of American cultural identity. The American ideal of the rugged individual who can succeed through personal effort and moral character owes more to mountain man mythology than most people realize. The notion that challenging experiences build character, that independence and self-reliance are essential virtues, that Americans should be willing to venture into unknown territories to pursue their dreams. These cultural values all reflect the influence of mountain man examples. Hollywood westerns, adventure literature, and outdoor recreation culture have all contributed to keeping mountain man ideals alive in American consciousness, even when the historical realities of their experiences have been simplified or romanticized. But perhaps most importantly, the mountain men proved something about human potential that remains relevant regardless of changing historical circumstances. They demonstrated that human consciousness has capabilities that are rarely accessed under normal social conditions, but that become available when people are challenged by extreme circumstances and supported by appropriate cultural practices. The mountain men's ability to process enormous amounts of environmental information at an intuitive level, to maintain psychological stability during extended periods of uncertainty, to find meaning and purpose in challenging circumstances, these capabilities weren't unique to their historical moment. They were expressions of human potential that remains available to anyone willing to undertake the kind of disciplined consciousness development that extreme challenges can catalyze. Modern neuroscience is finally beginning to understand how the mountain men's psychological techniques actually worked. Brain imaging studies of meditation practitioners, extreme athletes, and military special operations personnel show neurological changes that mirror the consciousness development mountain men described in their own accounts. Enhanced connectivity between different brain regions, increased activity in areas associated with spatial awareness and threat detection, improved integration of conscious and unconscious information processing. These are measurable changes that occur when people undertake intensive consciousness development under challenging conditions. In other words, the mountain men weren't just tough guys who happened to survive in difficult circumstances. They were pioneers in human consciousness development who discovered techniques for optimizing mental function that modern science is only beginning to understand. And their legacy continues to influence contemporary approaches to everything, from leadership training to therapeutic intervention to personal development. Wilderness therapy programs help troubled teenagers by exposing them to controlled versions of the psychological challenges that forged mountain man consciousness. Military training incorporates stress inoculation and observation techniques that trace their origins to mountain man practices. Corporate leadership development programs use outdoor challenges to build the kind of mental resilience that mountain men developed through necessity. The mountain men proved that human beings are capable of extraordinary psychological development when challenged appropriately and supported by wisdom traditions that understand how consciousness can be enhanced through intensive practice. Their legacy reminds us that the comfortable, predictable conditions of modern life, while certainly preferable to the life-threatening challenges mountain men faced, may also limit our access to capabilities that remain dormant until extreme circumstances activate them. The mountain men didn't just survive in the wilderness, they discovered wilderness within themselves. And that internal wilderness, with all its potential for consciousness development and spiritual growth, remains available to anyone willing to undertake the kind of disciplined exploration that the mountain men pioneered. Their story isn't just history, it's a roadmap to human potential that remains as relevant today as it was 200 years ago in the Rocky Mountains. The wilderness may be smaller now, but the wilderness within human consciousness is as vast and unexplored as ever. And the mountain men's greatest gift to future generations wasn't the territories they mapped or the beaver pelts they harvested. It was their demonstration that human consciousness itself can be explored, developed, and optimized in ways that produce capabilities most people never even imagine are possible. That legacy is immortal, and it's waiting for anyone brave enough to begin their own journey into the wilderness within.